All right, welcome back. So I get asked the question all the time, is there another way to factor? And the answer to that is yes. I personally find the way that I've been teaching you, where you split up the first and last terms, I find that to be the fastest way for me personally. But today I'm going to show you another method that involves grouping. Before we do that though, I want to make sure that you really understand the first way, and specifically I want to make sure that you understand when the signs are the same or when the signs are different of your factors. So I have some nonsense problems here. You can't actually do anything with these, but I just want you to look at them and decide, well, what are the signs going to be? Are the signs going to be the same or different? And if they're the same, is it going to be both minus signs or both plus signs? So quick reminder, you're looking at the last term, right? Remember, we always split up the first and last term. The first term I always want you to split into a positive, but the last term, if the last term is negative, remember we're multiplying to get the last term. So if it's negative, the signs have to be different. So I need to put a plus sign and a minus sign. And it doesn't matter if you write it as a minus and then a plus in this case, because we don't actually know what pancake squared is or what syrup is or what maple is, right? So one more together. So number 2, look at the last term. The last term is positive, right? So because it's positive, I know I have to multiply 2 positives or 2 negatives together. Remember, you're always adding to get the middle term, right? Combining like terms to get the middle term. So because the middle term is negative, this one is going to be minus, minus. So now, I want you to stop the video and try 3 through 9 100% on your own, and then just chime in again to make sure that you have the correct answers. And here are the correct answers. Real quick, I just want to remind you, when the signs are different, because we don't know what Dutch, apple, and pie are, it doesn't matter if it goes plus minus or minus plus. So I switched it up a little bit, right? So as long as your signs are different there, it doesn't matter which one goes where. So let's move on. I have 5 problems here that I just want you to stop the video and factor. And I also want you to check your inners and your outers as you're going through and doing it. So completely stop the video. Take about 5 or 10 minutes right now to just do these 5 problems on your own and then tune back in. So here are the answers to those 5 problems. Now, if I were to ask you which of these problems were easier, hands down, you all would probably say 10, 11, and 12, right? The reason for that is because there's less opportunities to factor, less possibilities, right? If you look at 10, 11, and 12, the first term is always an x squared. So there's only one way to break up the x squared, that's x times x, right? So if you think about it, when you're breaking up the 40 in number 10, all you're doing is you're just trying to figure out, okay, what are the 2 numbers that would multiply to give me 40? But when I'm doing my inners and outers, they're going to add to give me negative 13, right? So negative 8 times negative 5 gives me 40. Negative 8 plus negative 5 gives me negative 13. And it works over here too, right? The 2 numbers that multiply to give me negative 100 are negative 25 and 4. And those also add to give me negative 21. Same here, 2 numbers that multiply to give me negative 12 but add to give me 11, they have to be negative 1 and 12. However, when we get down here, that doesn't work, right? We are still adding to get the middle term, right? When we check our inners and we check our outers, they still add to give me that middle term, but the factors I pick don't multiply to give me the last term. Because what makes that tricky is this first term, right? You're breaking up that first term, which changes my inners and my outers. So let's just take a look for just a second. If I do multiply my 2 middle terms here, negative 8 times negative 9, that gives me 72, right? So I could say, all right, well, if my 2 middle terms, they multiply to give me 72, they really multiply to give me 72x squared. Well, think about that. Let's take the first term. The first term is what makes this difficult. And the last term, right, the fact that we have to break up both of those. If I multiply 6x squared times 12, I get 72x squared, right? So really, these 2 middle terms, that's going to be true for all the problems. If the 2 middle terms will multiply to give you whatever the first and last term is, and they will add to give you the middle term. That's true over here in number 14, right? If I multiply 24x and negative 5 together, Well, what I get is negative 120, right? So negative 120, whoops, I wrote negative 20. That would be negative 120. If I multiply the first and last terms together, these two, oh, well, 10x squared times negative 120, or 10 times negative 120, gives me negative 120. X squared, really, but I'm not worried so much about the variables right now. Let's just think, so if I'm doing these, if I can figure out what my two middle terms are, I can solve this, I can factor this using grouping, right? So like think about it, basically, if I'm starting this problem from scratch, I'm thinking, okay, what are two numbers that would multiply to give me 72, but add to give me negative 17? Well, that would be negative 8x and negative 9x. So just bear with me for a second. If I could figure these terms out together, quick reminder, I could just rewrite this polynomial, 6x squared minus 17x plus 12. I could rewrite that as 6x squared. Instead of writing minus 17x, I know my middle terms have to be negative 8x and negative 9x. And then I have to put my last term as 12, right? You guys agree that what I just wrote there is equal to 6x squared minus 17x plus 12 because the middle terms are like terms. But if we can figure out what those middle terms are, we can solve this by grouping, right? So I could group the first two terms together and the last two terms together, and I just pull out GCFs, right? So my GCF of 6x squared minus 8x is going to be 2x. And when I pull out the 2x, I divide 6x squared by 2x, I get 3x. And negative 8x divided by 2x is negative 4. And so then the next group, a reminder, because the negative 9x, the first term is negative, I have to pull out a negative GCF. So I'm going to pull out a negative 3. And then when you pull out the negative 3 and divide negative 9x by negative 3, you get 3x. And then when you pull out negative 3 from 12, that gives me negative 4. So then there you go. Right here is the GCF of all the entire thing. That's one of your factors, 3x minus 4. And when you pull out the 3x minus 4, what you're left with is 2x minus 3. So there are your factors, just getting it a different way, right? So I'm not going to go through number 14 because we already have the factors there. Let's jump to the back and let's take a look at basically these trinomials are all in this form called ax squared plus bx plus c, which I have right here. The value of a is always the coefficient of x squared. So in 15 and 16 down here, a would be 3, and in 16, a would be 7. And then the b is always the coefficient of x, right, which would here be negative 2 and negative 53. And c is always going to be our constant, or the coefficient of our last term, because sometimes that last term has some variables on it. So basically the steps for factoring trinomials by grouping is we first steps first, if there's a GCF in the entire thing, we have to take it out. These two don't have GCFs. We'll get to that in just a minute. The next thing I do is I need to figure out what the product of the first and last term is. So you multiply the a, the first term, and the c term, the last term, of the polynomials together. And then what you do is you start thinking of factors of that product that would add to give us the middle term, which is b, right? Once I have those two factors, I just place those two factors up in between the ax squared and the c terms. And then I just factor by grouping. So let's just see what this looks like in reality, right? So first step, I just multiply my a terms and my c terms together. So that would give me the a term is 3 and the c term is negative 5, right? So I would just multiply those together and I would get negative 15. And then the sum I'm trying to find is whatever the middle term is, which is negative the bx term, which is the middle term. So I'm looking for two things that multiply to give me negative 15 and add to give me negative 2, right? So thinking of factors of 15, because it's negative, we know our signs have to be the same. So I could do 5 and negative 3, right? But if you think about 5 and negative 3, if I add those together, does that give me negative 2? It doesn't give me negative 2, but it does give me 2, right? So that means my sign just has to be on the bigger number. So negative 5 times 3 does give me negative 15, but it does add to give me positive 2. So what that means is I found my two middle terms, right? I found the two things that I'm adding together to give me that middle term. So I just rewrite the polynomial now as 3x squared, I'm basically breaking up the negative 2x into negative 5x plus 3x, because negative 5x plus 3x is negative 2x, and then I'm bringing down my minus 5. So I'm just basically trying to break up my trinomial now into what did it look like before I combined like terms. Now we just group, right? We put those together, the first two together. The GCF of 3x squared minus 5x is just x, right? You pull out the x, and you're going to be left with 3x minus 5. And then the second group, we don't actually have a GCF there, but we have to pull out a 1. The reason we have to pull out a 1 is because it's a placeholder for us. And then when you pull out the 1, you still just have 3x minus 5. And so then if you notice, the 3x minus 5 is what the two terms now have in common. So I pull out that 3x minus 5, and I'm left with the coefficients of that, x plus 1. And there are my factors. And just a quick reminder, you could just double check to make sure you did it correctly by going through and doing FOIL, right? 3x times x is 3x squared. 3x times 1 is 3x, right, which is what I have there. And then negative 5 times x is negative 5x, which is what I have here. Those are like terms. Negative 5x plus 3x does give me negative 2x. And then the last term's negative 5 times 1 does give me negative 5. It's just another option of figuring it out. So let's try it again. First step, multiply a and c together, right? So in the next one, it's going to be a little bit bigger. Sometimes it's best to just have a calculator. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to multiply 7 times 28 together. And that gives me 196. And so the product I'm trying to find two numbers that multiply to give me 196, but add to give me the middle number, which is negative 53, right? Now, I don't know factors of 196 off the top of my head. I have to figure them out. But I do know that I just multiplied 7 times 28, so let's start there. The 7 plus 28 give me negative 53. Well, no, I mean, that gives me positive 35. Another thing to note is I need a negative number here. So since I need a positive 196, again, my signs have to be the same, right? And so that would then give me negative 35. Still, that one doesn't work, right? So then I'm just going to think through more factors, right? So again, I don't know factors of 196, so I am thinking, well, 196 is an even number, so why don't I divide it by 2? Well, so that would give me 2, and what would that be? 98, right? So then I'm like, okay, well then would negative 2 and negative 98 work? And no, that's going to give me negative 100, so that's not going to work. Other things I'm thinking is, okay, so I know that 4 goes into 28, so 4 probably goes into 196 as well. So then I'm going to do 196 divided by 4 and see what happens there. So I get 4 and 49. So, okay, well, negative 4 and negative 49. Oh, great. If I add those together, that does give me negative 53. So that means these are my two middle terms. So then I'm going to split up the negative 53 into negative 4x and negative 49x. So I'm going to break this into 7x squared minus 4x minus 49x plus 28. I feel like I should also mention right now, it doesn't matter what order you put the negative 4x and the negative 49x in. You could put negative 49x in first and then the negative 4x. Your factors will they'll be the same factors in the end. They'll just be in a different order than mine. So it really doesn't matter what order you put those in because of the commutative property. So now we're going to group it, right? We're going to group the first two and the last two terms together. So we're going to pull out the GCF. The first group is just an x. And then you're left with a 7x minus 4. And then in the second group, the GCF of negative 49 and 28 is going to be negative 7. We're pulling out a negative 7 because that first term is negative. That's going to then give me 7x minus 4. And so now we're right on our way to factor by grouping, right? 7x minus 4 is the GCF of these, so that's one of my factors, 7x minus 4. And then what's left when I pull out the 7x minus 4 is going to be an x minus 7. And there you go. Those are your two factors. There really wasn't a lot of trial and error there. You're just looking for two things that multiply to give you whatever a times c is and add to give you whatever bx is, or the b term is. All right, let's move on. All right, so when I ask you to factor, I'm not always going to give you that little box off to the side that says product and sum, because you don't have to use this method, right? You could use the method I taught you before this. So let's just practice though. Like if I want to use this method, I'm thinking to myself, okay, I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to give me whatever A times C is, right? A is 3, C is 7, so that's 21. So I'm looking for two things that multiply to give me 21, but then that add to give me that middle number of 22, right? So, automatically I think of 7 times 3 because those are the two numbers I just multiplied together. Well, 7 times 3 gives me 11. That's not going to work. Well, think about it. It's got to be 1 and 21, right? Because 1 plus 21 gives me 22. So my middle terms here are going to be 1x and 21x. So I'm going to rewrite the problem so that it says 3x squared plus x, you can write 1x if you want, plus 21x plus 7. And then group them, right? Group your first two together. The GCF is x, which is going to leave me with 3x plus 1. That plus 1 is important because x divided by x is 1, right? Also, just a quick reminder, like that 1 is important because if I distribute this back in, I have to have that space for the 1, right? The next one, my GCF there is going to be 7, so I'm going to pull out a 7. And when I pull out the 7, that gives me 3x plus 1. So then I have 3x plus 1 in common, so that's one of my factors, 3x plus 1. And then x plus 7. Now, it's very possible that if you did this problem on your own and you switched it, right? So let me just show you. If you switch the x and the 21x, you're still going to get the same answer. It's just going to look slightly different. So I'm going to have 3x squared plus 21x plus x plus 7. The only difference is going to be that I'm going to pull out 3x here and be left with x plus 7. So the x plus 7 is going to be what's inside the parentheses to start with, right? I pull out the 1, I'm left with x plus 7. And then these guys come out to give me x plus 7, and then your other factor is 3x plus 1. Same answer, same process, just in a different order. X plus 7 is a factor, 3x plus 1 is a factor. Again, if you're really feeling like you could try this at this point, go ahead and stop the video. I'm going to do this one with you as well. All right, so first we got to figure out two things that multiply to give me whatever A times C is. So 6 times 25. Well, 6 times 25 is 150, right? So I'm looking for two things that multiply to give me 150, but add to give me the middle term of 25, right? So immediately I just think, okay, does 6 and 25 work, right? And it's nice because all my signs are going to be the same in this one. And 6 and 25, that doesn't work, right? Let's think of some more factors. So I know 5 goes into it, right? So I could try 5 and 30. Well, 5 and 30 don't add to give me 25. So let's keep thinking. Let's see, 10. 10 goes into 150. Oh, 10 and 15, right? 10 and 15 give me 25. So those are my two middle numbers, right? I'm going to bring this down here. So now I'm going to have 6x squared. That's my first term. I'm breaking up 25x into 10x and 15x. If you've done this on your own, if you put 15x first and then 10x, that's fine. That's totally fine. Your work's just going to look slightly different than mine until the end, right? Then you put the first two terms together, the last two terms together. The GCF of 6x squared is going to be 2x. When you pull out the 2x, you're left with 3x plus 5. The GCF of 15x and 25 is 5. So it's a positive 5, so I'm going to put plus 5 there. Pull that out, I'm going to get 3x plus 5, right? So 3x plus 5 is what they have in common. And then what's left, when you pull out that 3x plus 5, is the 2x plus 5. Again, if you go through and do FOIL with that, you're going to get 6x squared plus 25x plus 25. These next two are slightly more difficult. Remember on the very first day of factoring, I taught you that the first step to factoring is to pull out a GCF, right? That's true always, right? So if you have a polynomial that you are about to factor, before you even start the problem, you should ask yourself, does the entire thing have a greatest common factor? If it does, you need to write that down, okay? That's one of your factors. You got to pull it out. And pulling out that GCF is going to make the problem so much easier, and it's going to make sure that your answers are correct. So when you're 100% done factoring, none of your factors should contain greatest common factors. If they do, it's not correct. So let's look at number 19 to start with. Let's start first by asking myself, does this have a GCF? And if it does, what is it? So what does it have? What do they all have in common? So if you take a look, we've got 12, 10, and 12. Well, the thing that they all have in common is the factor of 2. The other thing that they all have in common is they all have a y. So I'm going to start this problem off by pulling out a 2y, all right? So I pull out the 2y. When I pull out the 2y, I'm left with 6x squared plus 5x minus 6. Now, the thing I am now trying to factor into binomials is this, 6x squared plus 5x minus 6. So we're kind of ignoring this for a moment, right? I pulled out the 2y. That's a factor. It has to hang out all the way to the very end. We can't get rid of that 2y. It's a factor, all right? However, when I go to factor this into binomials, let's use our new method of factoring by grouping. Multiply 6 times negative 6 together. That's going to give me negative 36. So I want two things that multiply to give me negative 36, but add to give me this middle number. Not this middle number, this middle number. Add to give me 5. All right, so automatically, I know my answers, my terms have to be different signs. So I'm thinking negative 6 and 6. Well, that's not going to work because that's going to give me 0. So let's think of other factors of 6. So let's see, 3 goes into it. So we would say negative 3 and 12. Well, negative 3 and 12 when added does not give me 5, so that doesn't work. So let's think of some other factors. What about 4, right? Negative 9 and 4. So I could do, or actually negative 4 and positive 9. We want the negative sign to be on the smaller number because we're trying to get a positive 5, right? So there we go. We have it. That one works. So that means my middle terms are negative 4x and 9x. This 2y, I'm just going to keep it there, right? And then I'm going to now take this, and I'm rewriting that as 6x squared minus 4x plus 9x minus 6. And then again, this 2y hangs out. I'm about to group this stuff with parentheses, so I'm going to change this to brackets for just a moment. And so I'm going to pull out now the GCF of the 6x squared minus 4x, which is 2x. I'm going to be left with 3x minus 2. And then I'm going to pull out the GCF of 9x minus 6, which is going to be 3. Divide both of those by 3. I'm going to get 3x minus 2. Close my brackets. So now the GCF of this is 3x minus 2. So now that's going to be one of my factors, 3x minus 2. And then what's left is 2x plus 3. Now those are the factors of just the 6x squared plus 5x minus 6. Don't forget that GCF. That GCF is part of your answer. So this polynomial ends up having 3 factors, right? So you got to pull out the GCF, and it just hangs out there until the very end. So I just keep bringing it down so I don't forget about it. All right? If you feel like you got it, give the next one a try. Okay? I will give you a hint. In number 20, your GCF is negative. So feel free to stop the video and give it a try. I'm going to go ahead and explain it. So remember, when I taught you GCFs, if the leading coefficient is negative, I have to pull out a negative number. All right, so because that's negative, I'm going to pull out a negative number. So I'm thinking of my factors of 16, 60, and 100. I'm immediately thinking of 2, but then I'm remembering, oh wait, if I divide these each by 2, they're still even, so it's probably 4, right? So I'm going to pull out a negative 4. So negative 4 is my GCF. I'm going to pull that out to start with and divide everything by negative 4. All right, so then I'm going to get 4x squared plus 15x minus 25. All right, so now this negative 4 hangs out to the front, and I'm going to now take 4x squared, and I need to try to figure out what my middle terms are going to be, right? So I'm running out of room, so I'm going to do it down here in the corner. I want two things that multiply to give me negative 100, right? Because I'm looking for the product of 4 and negative 25. And then I want two things that add to give me 15. So I'm going to play around with some numbers. I'm going to start with 4 and 25, right? So 4 and 25, think for a second my signs have to be different to get negative 25. Because I want a positive in the middle, the smaller number has to be negative. But negative 4 and 25 give me 21, so that's not going to work, right? So let's think of some other factors. What about 20 and 5, right? So what about if I have 20 and 5, the signs have to be different. I want it to be negative 5. Another reminder, when you are multiplying a positive and a negative together, it gives you a negative. When you add them, it's like you're subtracting, right? 20 and negative 5 is the same as 20 minus 5. Well, that gives me 15, so that one works. So my middle terms are 20x and negative 5x. Again, it doesn't matter if you put the 20x first or the negative 5 first. So I'm going to put 20x minus 5x minus 25. Okay? Reminder, you've pulled out this GCF, so it hangs out to the front. And the thing that we're factoring is the middle, this thing in the parentheses, right? So that's the thing we're looking for. So now I'm going to factor by grouping. I'm going to change this to a bracket. If you don't change it to a bracket and you just have lots of parentheses, that's fine. I want to group those together. So that's going to give me 4x. When I pull out the 4x, I'm going to get x plus 5. Then I'm going to group these together. Reminder, since there's a minus sign right there, you're pulling out a negative and dividing both of those terms by negative 5, which is going to leave me with x plus 5. So again, hopefully you're starting to catch on. If your two sets of parentheses don't come up with the same number, you're probably doing something wrong, okay? That does later mean that the polynomial is probably not factorable, but we'll talk about that later. So now I have negative 4 is one of my GCF, and my answer is going to be x plus 5, and then 4x minus 5. All right? Now I want you to stop the video, and you need to try both 21 and 22 on your own. We can go over those in class next time I see you, or you can just time in and see if you got the right answers. Okay, so you're doing those two on your own. No questions asked. No, really, did you stop the video? If you didn't, stop the video. If you did, here are the answers. All right, and so here are your answers for 21 and 22. Quick reminder, when you pull out GCFs, I know it can get confusing with like pulling out a 1 and when to pull out a 1. Like, so looking at this problem right here, you may have been like, well, the GCF is 1. We don't care about the GCF being 1 when you're just factoring this trinomial. The only time you want to pull out a 1 is when you're grouping, right? The reason is because I need to have that other factor, right? You need to have, like, you have to have the 1 here in order to get this other factor, okay? So you should always, when you're grouping, have a number in front of your parentheses, always, and then the other, then these two sets of parentheses will be the same, all right? So you are finished. This is how you can factor trinomials by grouping. All right. If you are curious about one more way to do this, there are actually 2 more I can think of, but if you're curious about one more way to do this, stay tuned. Okay. So if you're done and this is enough for you, just stop the video. That's fine. But if you're interested in one more, here we go. What I want to do, I'm just going to take the polynomial number 21, the 4x squared minus 17x plus 4, and real quick, I'm just going to check it. Instead of checking it with FOIL, I'm going to check it using the box method. All right, so real fast, I'm just checking this. So thinking about like when we were doing tiles, I would put the x minus 4 on the top and the 4x minus 1 on the side, right? And then I would multiply, right? Whatever goes in this first box is x times 4x, which is 4x squared, right? Whatever goes in this box is the negative 4 times the 4x, which is negative 16x, right? Whatever goes here is going to be the x times negative 1, which is negative x, and then whatever goes in this last box is going to be negative 4 times negative 1, which is positive 4, right? So basically I have a 4x squared. Oh, that's what I had here. I had negative 16x and negative x together. This gives me negative 17x, which is what I want, and that's what I had here, right? And then here is my 4, right? So if I'm looking at a box, the first term has to equal that, right? Which is that. The term in this corner right here has to equal the last term, right? And then these two are your x terms split up, right? So if I'm taking this polynomial, 4x squared minus 17x plus 4, I'm placing my 4x squared here, I'm placing my 4 here. I'm finding my negative x and my negative 16 the same exact way that I do over here. You multiply these two boxes together to get the 16. You add, and then you're adding to get negative 17. These two boxes have to add to give you your middle term, right? So now if you can place the numbers, basically the numbers that we have here in the boxes, then you can get your answer by just pulling out your GCFs of your rows and your columns, right? So look, if I pull out the GCF of 4x squared and negative x, that's x. If I pull out the GCF of negative 16x and 4, that's negative 4. If I pull out the GCF of 4x squared and negative 6x, that's 4x. If I pull out the GCF of 4 and negative x, that's negative 1. And then you have your factors without grouping. So it's the same method, except when you're instead of putting the stuff in a straight line and factoring by grouping, you're just putting the problem in a box, right? So let's just look at the next problem for just a minute, right? So we would always start the problem by pulling out your GCF. So I would just be like, okay, I know that I have a GCF of negative 2, not negative 5. I have a GCF of negative 2 to start with. And what I have left is the 5x squared minus 18x plus 9. So what I would do is I would draw a box, right? I would draw a box, and I would be like, okay, whatever goes in this first corner, it has to equal 5x squared, right? And then I'm looking for positive 9. And then you follow the same thing we did up here. You're looking for two things that multiply to give you 5 and 9, or you can even look at it like two things that multiply to give you this, but add to give you the middle number, right? And we already found that it was negative 3x and negative 15x. So the two middle terms would go in these other two corners. So it would be negative 3x and negative 15x. And then what you do is you get your answer by pulling out the GCFs of your columns and rows, right? So the GCF, oops, I don't know why I'm erasing it. There we go. So the GCF of this column right here would be 5x. So I'd put a 5x up here. The GCF of this column, because the first term is negative, would be negative 3. So there's one of your factors, 5x minus 3. And then you get the GCF of this row, which is going to be just x. And then the GCF of this row is going to be negative 3. So then your other factor is x minus 3. So then you just have to remember that you pulled out the 2, and then this 5x minus 3 is this factor, and this x minus 3 is this factor. So it's just another way of looking at it, right? At this point, I think it's a good idea to practice one of these methods, but if you are perfectly happy with the first method that I showed you, that's fine. I'm not going to require you to know all the methods.